Tonight, a Cronkite News special presentation. Award-winning primetime CNN anchor Anderson Cooper accepts the 2018 Cronkite Award for Excellence in Journalism from ASU at the 35th Annual Cronkite Luncheon in downtown Phoenix.
It is my great privilege to introduce this year's Cronkite Award honoree. Anderson Cooper represents the very best of Walter Cronkite's legacy. Like Mr. Cronkite, Mr. Cooper has traveled around the world to bring global issues closer to home. In some regards, I feel as if I already know Mr. Cooper. His reporting is a constant presence on the big screen in our First Amendment Forum here at the Cronkite School, and I've sat in the forum with hundreds of other students watching him break the biggest news stories during my 4 years here at ASU. Thank you, Mr. Cooper, for being a leading example for us students here at the Cronkite School.
Whoa. He goes out there determined to do what reporters, what journalists are supposed to do, get the news, get the facts.
He speaks truth to power, holds people accountable.
He has a powerful platform, and I think he's used it really responsibly.
He's not just smart, he's wise. That's rare on television.
He doesn't take himself too seriously, and he is an honest person.
Especially in this day and age when it seems things are the opposite of conscientious and respectful, he stands out.
And he's also not afraid to go out there and risk his own life reporting the news.
He cares about the people, about the places, and about the issues he covers.
I think Anderson is one of the giants of television news. He's unrelentingly fair, he's unrelentingly passionate, and he cares about getting to the truth.
Good evening. We begin tonight with hundreds of extra police officers.
Well, I think his evolution as a person and as a journalist on television for the last 20 plus years has been quite remarkable.
A lot of times he tells this story of making a fake press pass and sneaking into Burma, where he first really realized that there were stories out there that not only could be told, but needed to be told. He made people stand up and realize, wait, this guy is doing something that, first of all, is really brave, but also really important.
10 strangers playing for up to $1 million.
I first heard of him as The Mole, which is a reality show, and then he was at ABC, and then he came to CNN. And it was at a time when, wars were starting, conflicts were starting.
One of the first assignments we both had jointly was when we went to the Persian Gulf as the U.S. was preparing for the war in 2003 against Saddam Hussein and Iraq.
He's often the first one on the ground, but it's not for bragging rights. It's because he knows how important it is to be there, to tell the story, to get the word out, and to make sure that it's done correctly.
He knows it's a tough, angry, nasty world. He's not afraid to go to the front lines and report on it.
And then I think that reached a real apogee, a real height with Hurricane Katrina, when Anderson made his indelible mark on the environment, essentially, on the body politic, on media, because his empathy and his anger about what was going on there and what was happening to these poor stranded civilians was palpable and was expressed at a time when wasn't that cool for anchors or reporters to express that kind of feeling.
It's a sickening sight, and it is just incredible to think that you're in the United States. I've never seen anything like this in the United States.
And he held people accountable in that instance. And it stuck with him. That's kind of the emblematic, iconic moment that solidified him in this sort of pantheon of media heavyweights.
Obviously, he's done daytime television, he's done primetime television, he's done broadcast television, he's done cable television, he does an evening news show, and he does New Year's Eve. And there are very few people with that range, and I think that's really his immense talent, is that he's got interest in many things and ability in almost everything.
In war zones, in the middle of natural disasters, school shootings, you have someone who is going to treat people with respect.
We think it's important that you hear their names.
People who have lost so much already, who sometimes aren't sure that they want their stories to be told, will then sit down with Anderson. And not only will their stories be told, but respect will be paid.
What he is incredibly authentic. And he talks like a real person, he asks the questions that we want to hear, and he gets the answers.
Unlike anybody else, I think, really on television, is he's an incredible listener. We may go in with a set of questions that are pre-planned, but he actually listens to what the person says, and it becomes a conversation. He doesn't prejudge.
Well, we have to have exemplars of integrity in moments of polarization so people feel as if there's some empirical grounding in terms of facts, there's some theoretical fairness in terms of different perspectives, but most importantly, in terms of character.
I think Anderson, above all else, really wants to make sure that he gets things right. I know that sounds maybe kind of obvious, but you know, it's a standard that I think he has set for himself, certainly, and a standard that has transmitted through the rest of the network.
On some streets, the devastation is it's just catastrophic.
We found ourselves in Haiti 12 hours after the earthquake, and then we ended up spending a month there. It was extremely powerful, his reporting. I think more than anything else sort of spoke to his ability and professionalism to be able to just sort of put his head down and tell a story in a way that nobody else can.
I remember we were in Japan. It was after the tsunami and the subsequent Fukushima nuclear disaster, and we'd been there for a long time, and we had not slept, hardly at all. And I remember every morning we would sort of kind of joke around a little bit. You leaving today? Because I'm not. And we'd kind of constantly try and top each other because neither one of us actually wanted to leave that story.
I was wounded on a mission to try to rescue a young Army guy, Bo Bergdahl is his name, and after he was released, there wasn't a whole lot of information about, you know, the rescue missions that had gone on to try to get him back. And I felt like, people needed to know about it, and so in my mind it was very easy to kind of settle on Anderson. There was one question that I wasn't really comfortable answering, and I thought maybe it would be, a problem, but I answered the question with, I don't really want to be the pinball between, the either end of the binary culture it seems like we're in right now. And he said, yeah, I totally get it, cable news, there's a lot of shouting. He gives me a little bit of faith and hope in a part of our culture, an American culture, that is extremely important. It's part of the checks and balances.
Keeping them honest has been one of his critically important trademarks. Anderson handles these presidential candidates, all candidates, politicians, extremely well because he goes in so well prepared in the tradition of a Walter Cronkite, because so much is at stake.
Above all else, Anderson wants his stories to have purpose. They're not just some sideshow, it's not just some circus, but at the end of the day, what kind of impact did I really have? I think that's a question he asks himself every single time.
I think the thing that surprised me the most about Anderson is that he's actually really funny.
I will say that he is the hardest working Vanderbilt I've ever met.
I've always suspected that Anderson's career really took off when he followed in my tradition and put on the glasses. Who's more of a dreamboat? Would that be you or me? He puts them on, takes them off, puts them on, takes them off. Maybe with a few viewers out there, he looks smarter. It's not going to work.
It's not just the gray hair. It's not just the voice of authority. It's not even that little giggle that he does sometimes in the middle of these segments.
He can laugh at himself. He can laugh at other people too, but he doesn't do it at their expense.
Get ready for Anderson Cooper 360.
He believes in that Walter Cronkite tradition. He embodies it, that what he is doing is so critically important, especially at a time like this when there are so many out there who criticize those of us in the news media.
The country is so tribal right now in terms of you have to take a stand and be on one side or the other. He doesn't do that. And though, the times have changed since Walter Cronkite was working to now, I do think the biggest parallel is that he wants to give, and he does give, everyone a fair hearing.
There are very few people on American television these days who symbolize and embody and embrace the values of what we as journalists do.
And he always shows that in his compassion in dealing with people, those who wear a suit and those who have nothing on their back. And I think that's what makes Anderson Cooper one of the all-time greats.
The young journalist must realize that like Walter Cronkite, like Anderson Cooper, that journalism is a call. It's not just a career. It's a vocation. It's not just a profession. It's a fundamental commitment to something bigger than each and every one of us.
Anderson has said that Walter Cronkite inspired him at a young age. Anderson is doing that every single day for the next generation of journalists.
it's really an incredible honor to be here, and it's quite intimidating knowing the remarkable roster of journalists and broadcasters who have been here before me. I'm old enough to have grown up watching Walter Cronkite and the incredible team that he assembled around him at CBS News. And it was Walter Cronkite and that team, and Bob Simon and Eric Sevareid, who really sparked my interest in the world and my earliest thoughts of perhaps one day being a foreign correspondent. So it's kind of surreal for me to be, quite frankly, to be standing here receiving the Cronkite Award. I should point out I actually met Walter Cronkite a number of times when I was a little kid, and I met his wife. I didn't know him very well, but he was always very sweet to me. I did have a rather strange experience with Walter Cronkite that I will just briefly tell you about. In the later years of his life, I was asked to introduce him on stage at the Jewish University in Los Angeles. This was several years before he passed away, and then to do a little interview with him about his career. So he arrived, and he and I met backstage, and he was lovely, and he was just fantastic, and he had somebody with him who I went over the questions with, and just to make sure that that he would be comfortable with everything. And at that point, his hearing wasn't very good, and so when he was on stage, he had a double IFB system. He had an IFB in both ears that was connected to a microphone that his assistant had off stage. So when I would ask him a question, she would repeat the question into a mic that went directly into his ears. So he came out. I was so thrilled to do this. To be on the same stage with Walter Cronkite is incredible. He sits down. He says something very sweet about my work. People applaud. I asked him the first question. He answers the question. He's funny. He's charming. It's a great story. I asked him the second question, and he looks at me, and I ask the question again, and then he says, my ear system isn't working. The IFBs have broken. So it ended up with me screaming at Walter Cronkite on a stage in front of 5,000 people. And it got to the point where I was screaming one word, like, Vietnam! to spark him to then tell the Vietnam story. Or like, Kennedy, shot, you cried. And thank God this was in the days before Twitter, because people have been tweeting like, why is Anderson Cooper screaming at Walter Cronkite of all people? Anyway, Walter was fantastic and so generous afterward. He was like, wow, you handled that pretty well. That was impressive. I probably shouldn't actually tell you this, but when I was first asked to come here today, I actually declined, and I was saying my schedule was really tough, and with the election coming up and working for CNN and 60 Minutes, I didn't think I could do it. And then I got a call back informing me that nobody has ever declined this, and I realized I'm a complete jerk, and so I instantly, of course, said I would be very honored to come, which in fact I am. But I like full transparency, but to explain, it's not that I wasn't honored by the very thought of it. The true truth of it, and I know this may sound like I'm being falsely modest, but I really, truly do not believe I deserve this recognition, because I still feel like there's a lot I need to learn and can learn, and that there's a lot I can get better at. When I look at my career thus far, I see a few things, literally just a few things here and there that I'm content with, but more often than not, I see moments that I missed or questions that I didn't think to ask in the moment. I see words, I think of words that I failed to write or sentences that I failed to think of. I wanted to be a correspondent because I wanted to bear witness to events around the globe. I wanted to go to places and shine a light on something that was surrounded in darkness or something that had been hidden. And I've reported in more than 40 countries in the last 18 years, but I've only rarely ever been satisfied with my ability to truly convey what's happening somewhere. When you're in a place like Port-au-Prince in the hours after an earthquake, the morning after an earthquake, in which some 200,000 people have been killed, and you're surrounded by mothers who are searching for the bodies of their children, or you see a father carrying his infant child in a wheelbarrow looking for a place to bury him, and there's no place to bury him. Or you see people digging through the rubble with bare and bloodied hands, and you can hear the faint cries of children who are trapped beneath tons of concrete. And you try to capture all of that. You try to convey all of that, Not just the facts and the numbers and the names, but the sounds and the smells and even the silences. You try to find words to convey the horror and the humanity that you're surrounded by. And more than anything else, you just want to do justice to what's happening. Not just get the facts right, that's the first step, obviously. But you want to do justice to the lives that have been lost and do justice to those who have survived and whose lives will be forever changed. You want somebody who's watching, whether they're watching at home or on a mobile device or on a treadmill at the gym, you want them not just to understand what's happening, but for those few minutes to feel what is happening. And you hope that what you do creates some kind of understanding, some kind of reaction. But the truth is that more often than not, you fail because that camera lens is so small. It's this little piece of tiny glass. And it's so hard to kind of cram all the stuff that you see and you feel and you hear into that little camera lens. Sometimes I feel I've come close to doing justice to what I've had the painful privilege of bearing witness to, but more often than not, I feel like it's not good enough. These are not just stories that we cover. It's real life and it's real death. The other reason that I was reticent to be here is because those of us, I think, in front of the camera get far too much recognition as it is. Behind the camera, in the field and in newsrooms around the globe right now, there are women and men whose names will not appear on an award or a plaque, women and men who are working long hours for far less pay than I'm making, who are making tremendous sacrifices and often taking personal risks to make it possible for me to do my job. And I'm talking about photojournalists and producers and researchers and engineers and editors and satellite truck operators and executives. And I wish they were here with me today. I wish they were the ones here. Well, actually, maybe not the executives. They're not really that fun a group. But pardon me, there are a couple of TV executives right there here. But I'm talking national, not local. Anyway. The Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications, it's obviously world-renowned, and I'm so impressed by how many of the students that I've met so far have a vision for what they want their careers to be and who they want to be. I should point out, when I graduated college, I really had no idea what I wanted to be or what I wanted to do with my life. In desperation, my senior year of college, I asked my mom for her advice, which is something I rarely did growing up. As my executive producer, Charlie Moore, mentioned, my mom is Gloria Vanderbilt, so I come from a long line of layabouts. And, but my mom is a remarkable lady, but practical, she's not. So she wasn't really the parent you would go to for sort of like actual practical advice. She said, follow your bliss. Now, you laugh, I know. Follow your bliss. It's actually not original advice. It's not even a term my mom came up with. Bill Moyers, who received this award in 1995, was interviewing a professor named Joseph Campbell on public television, and this professor, Joseph Campbell, had come up with this term, follow your bliss. So my mom basically just gave me life advice she had cribbed from watching television. So I'm thankful she wasn't watching, Maury, because I don't know, she would have told me to get a DNA test or something. The problem with follow your bliss is I think any students who are in this room may know, is that it is difficult to figure out what your bliss is, and certainly at the time I wasn't very sure. I hadn't studied journalism. I had a liberal arts degree, which means I graduated without an actual skill. And, but I'd always been interested in news and television. As I said, I grew up watching Walter Cronkite, and I'd been really interested particularly in the experiences of war correspondents in the Vietnam War. And I'd left actually high school a semester early, and I'd ridden in a truck across sub-Saharan Africa for about 5 months. And Africa had opened my eyes and it quickened my pulse. And it was to Africa that I decided to go a couple of years after graduation to try to become a reporter. I hadn't been able to get an entry-level job at CBS News or at ABC News. I'd worked for a few months at a thing called Channel 1, which was a show seen in about half the middle schools and high schools in the United States at the time. And I'd been a fact checker there. But no one would give me a chance to be on air as a reporter, so I figured if no one was going to give me a chance, I'd have to take a chance. If no one was going to give me an opportunity, I have to try to create my own opportunity. So because I'd read a lot about the Vietnam War correspondents, I decided to just start going to wars. And the director of Channel 1, I quit my job at Channel 1, the director kindly made me a fake press pass, which will, no doubt probably please the president. And armed with this press pass and a home video camera, which I borrowed from Channel 1, I moved overseas. I snuck into Burma, into Myanmar, and hooked up some students fighting the Burmese government. From there, I ended up in Somalia in the early days of a famine, and also a civil war that was going on in 1992. And until I'd been to Somalia, I'd never seen somebody die in front of me. I was in a town called Baidoa where about 100 people were dying every day, and you would see their bodies along the road, or you would see them piled up in makeshift morgues like stacks of kindling wood. And I remember my first night, I was sitting in a hut that was made out of twigs, and I was watching a man and his wife fill a kettle with what little water they had left. And they'd come to Baidoa because they thought there was food there, but there was no food to be had. And between them lay their young son, who had just died while I was there, and his body was covered in a shroud and a dirty cloth. And I'll never forget this, the little boy's legs were as thin as some of the twigs which formed the outer layer of the hut that we were in. And the man held his son's head in his left hand, and the woman poured the contents of the kettle over her son to wash his body to prepare him for burial. And they had already watched 3 of their other children die, and this was their last child, and he was just 5 years old. And it was in Somalia, in that moment, that first trip, that I knew that I'd found my calling. I knew I couldn't stop the starvation. I couldn't actually save people's lives, but I could bear witness to their struggles. I could learn their names, and I could tell their stories, so at least they weren't dying in silence. In those early years as a correspondent in Somalia, and then in Sarajevo, and then in Rwanda and Haiti, I saw firsthand how easily societies fall apart, how the thin veneer of civilization, to use a term that General Michael Hayden has used recently in my broadcast, how thin the veneer of civilization really is. It doesn't take much for the institutions and the values that we like to think are rock solid to begin to crack and to crumble. It happens sometimes before anybody realizes it, and it happens in the broad light of day. Leaders manipulate divisions, they attack the press, lies are called truth, truth is called a lie, societies divide along ethnic, religious, and political lines, and chaos ensues. I'm speaking about what I've seen overseas, but I'm also speaking about what can happen here. Truth, as we've heard today, is under assault. Facts are called fake. Lies are used to divide us, to weaken confidence in journalism and in the core institutions that are essential to maintaining our democracy. Thousands of Americans died in Puerto Rico in the wake of a devastating hurricane, and they died because of a lack of electricity and access to medicines and doctors that they would normally be able to go to. They died, but their deaths are not recognized by some because it doesn't fit their agenda. Politicians and their families right now are heckled in restaurants by people who are so convinced of their righteousness that they feel someone who disagrees with them must be evil and attacked. Reporters are labeled the enemy of the people. This is where we are. There is certainly much to criticize in the media, much to analyze and to improve upon, but this I know. I know that the kids who are studying here to become journalists are not the enemies of the people, nor the people I know who work every day to report facts. Tim Hetherington, who was a friend of mine, a photojournalist killed in Libya who bled out when a mortar landed nearby him, he was not the enemy of the people, nor was Marie Colvin, who was assassinated in Syria several hours after I talked to her, nor was Dan Eldon, who was killed by a mob in Somalia, nor was Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed and likely dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. These were people seeking the truth, asking questions, doing their job, a job so important that it is protected in our Constitution. So the question is, what is to be done? Unlike many in cable news, I'm not a believer in wearing my political beliefs on my sleeve. I don't look to be a liberal reporter or conservative reporter. I don't want to be a Democratic reporter or Republican reporter. I believe that all of you, all audiences, are smart enough and smarter than many of us on television to make up their own minds about who to vote for. People want facts and they want information, and given that, they can make up their own minds. The answer, in my mind, to the attacks on reporting is more reporting. And I'm not the first person to say this, but I believe it with all my heart. The thing that gives me the most hope, the thing that I've seen all around the world in the 18 years that I've been reporting, is the power that each of us has to reach out and to care for someone else. In the midst of tragedies and disasters, I've seen so many acts of bravery and selflessness by individuals. During the tsunami in Japan, people at risk of their own lives reached out to save complete strangers being swept away by floodwaters. In the earthquake in Haiti, citizens who had been abandoned by their own government spent days digging through the rubble to save those who'd been trapped. Individuals make a difference. Each of us can make a difference. And it's the difference between success and failure. It's the difference between hope and heartache. It's the difference between life and death itself. Individuals standing up, not waiting to be told what to do, but taking responsibility ourselves. Too often, I think we dwell on the things that separate us, and certainly in the media, too often we dwell on the things that separate us, rather than the bonds that tie us one to another. And those bonds truly are at the core of who we are or who we can be when everything else is stripped away. That's the truth, and there is strength and I think hope in that. Several months ago, I'll conclude with this, I found online an old radio interview that my dad had given when he wrote a book in 1976. My dad died when I was 10 years old, and he was 50, which I used to think was a really old age, and now I'm 51, and I'm like, the clock is ticking. But I found online this old radio interview that had been restored and put online that my dad had given on public radio in 1976 talking about his book. And the company that had restored it sent me an email and said, we restored this interview, you should listen. So I clicked on it in my office a while ago, and it was the first time I heard my dad's voice since I was 10 years old. And one of the things he said stayed with me. He said, "We are, all of us, separately and together, engaged on the same tough journey. Each of us alike taste of its joys and sorrows. Each of us gets by as best he can. And we must, whenever possible, reach out to each other, tentatively to touch with our hands, with our minds, and with our hearts." That's what I try to do in my work as a reporter, and I think that's what happens every day at ASU. Undergraduates and graduate students, alumni and faculty reaching out with hands and minds and hearts. So thank you for that, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I appreciate it.